I was educated in the belief that culture was a selection of great works. In my case, Shakespeare, Dickens, D.H. Lawrence, Shelley, Milton, and a whole litany of other great writers. I guess for a Russian audience it would be Pushkin, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and so on. These people had one thing in common. They were all dead. They had a number of other things in common. They were all men as well. As Americans sometimes say, this definition of culture is culture produced by dead white men. I want to argue today that that's a mistaken view of culture. I want to argue not only is it mistaken, but it's not helpful in understanding how culture is produced and the culture which is being produced today. The first thing to say about these works is, of course, they are great achievements of the human spirit. I'm not denigrating Pushkin, I'm not denigrating Milton. These are great human achievements. However, they are only part of the history of human endeavour, part of the history of human attempts to understand and to live in the world. And I want to argue primarily for a different conception of culture. The great British cultural theorist, he was actually a Welsh cultural theorist, Raymond Williams, wrote a famous essay called "Culture is Ordinary." And in that he argued, yes, of course, the literary heritage that he grew up with, that he had acquired at Cambridge, was a valuable human achievement. But that if you looked at the everyday life of Britain in his day, of the world, you found that people were engaged in all sorts of activities, which, although perhaps not as extreme as those engaged in by the writers I've talked about, were obviously and identifiably the same sort of things. Shakespeare was trying to put into poetry, put into his plays, the experience of living in Elizabethan England, the emotional, the psychological, the historical experience of living in Elizabethan England. Everybody, to a greater or lesser extent, tries to do a similar kind of thing. That culture is not as again Raymond Williams put it, it's not only or exclusively a body of intellectual and imaginative works, it's also a whole way of life. The implications of this are that we have to recast what we think of as being culture. All of these great traditions, all of these lists of great names can be shown to be historically constructed. So, for example, all of the writers I've just cited have in common not only that they're dead, but that they are men. The great tradition of literature has tended to privilege male experiences, male achievements, male writing. And in the US, for example, many black people would say not only men, but white men have been privileged in terms of the achievements of culture. And for every great tradition that we can construct out of dead white men, perhaps we can construct alternative traditions of, for instance, of women. One classic example of this is visual representation. Visual representation in Western culture has centred around the painting, and particularly around the oil painting. This isn't the only tradition of visual representation in the West. There are other traditions of visual representation, notably embroidery. Now, we don't have to argue whether embroidery is as good as or better than oil painting. We simply have to recognise that this is a form of representation which half of the human race in the Western Europe in the 19th century engaged in. The other half maybe, well, some of the other half were engaged in painting, oil painting. Women were engaged in another form of visual representation. I don't want to engage in an argument about the aesthetic values. I want to simply say as cultural activities, we have to recognise a certain equivalence between these two things. What we understand by culture changes. It changes depending on our historical and our social conditions. Let me give you an example. When I first went to university, culture was literature, music, maybe one or two other things, painting, sculpture, blah, blah, blah. So today, if you go into a university, go into Oxford or Harvard or Lomonosov universities, you'll find young intellectuals talking not only about Shakespeare and Pushkin, of course they are still talking about Shakespeare and Pushkin, but they'll also be talking about Hitchcock and Tarkovsky and other great filmmakers. And these people will be accorded the same kind of respect, the same kind of attention as the great writers of the past. This is a clear evidence that over my lifetime, for that matter, film has moved from being a relatively despised popular form to being something recognised as a constitutive part of contemporary culture. So I think that we can reasonably say that in the future this definition of what is and isn't culture will change again. Things which are today despised, things which today parents try and stop their children doing, playing video games, for example, have every possibility of being recognised by our children, our grandchildren, as being cultural experiences in the same way as we recognise films and our grandparents recognised literature. This change, I think, is something which is a common experience of culture. So I want to argue that the starting point for an understanding of culture is not a small number of great works, is not works produced in the past. The starting point for understanding human culture is the way we live in the world today. And that opens a vista for all sorts of activities which today are dismissed and very often denigrated by intellectuals. So, for example, while in Moscow attending a performance of, let's say, ballet, since this is Russia, is recognised as being a cultural activity, so too attending a football match is a cultural activity. So too attending an ice hockey match is a cultural activity. Not the same kind of cultural activity, not very often experienced by the same people, not very often talked about in the same way, but nevertheless the same kind of activity, the same kind of response to a particular lived experience. And I think that any adequate account of contemporary culture has got to be much, much broader than certainly I was educated in. Educated in a notion that culture is narrow, exclusive, and in the past. Culture, on the contrary, is better understood as being broad, contemporary, and in the present. So let me turn to the form that I said is contemporarily despised, the video game. It clearly is widely despised. It's clearly regarded by many parents as being destructive of their children's educational achievement. It's often regarded by psychologists as being productive of forms of addiction. I can remember my grandmother saying to me when I was a young man reading novels, "Why are you wasting your time in novels?" She had been educated, not very well, in a world where factual literature occupied a central place. And today, parents are saying to their children, "Why are you wasting your time with video games?" No one would say to a child today, "Why are you wasting your time reading Tolstoy? Why are you wasting your time reading George Eliot?" They would accept that as being cultural activity. They won't accept that playing video game, Grand Theft Auto or whatever, is a legitimate cultural activity. I think that if you explore the worlds constructed by video games, you'll find that many of the activities, many of the characteristics which are present in classical novels are also present in video games. Moral dilemmas, choice, the difficulties of human relationships, and so on. Now they are expressed in a different way, and I'm not claiming for one moment that they embody the same depth and complexity as the great works of literature. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. That's not my argument. My argument is that they embody the same kinds of dilemmas as we expect to find in great literature. They have an important additional value. In literature, and indeed in cinema, you are outside the narrative. The narrative is presented to you as a given. You can consider the choices made by the protagonist. You can consider whether Anna Karenina was right to fling herself under the train or not. In a video game, you have to make the choice. Potentially, this is a much more involving, potentially this is a much more total experience of culture than the novel. So I think that a literary form which is what? A cultural form which is what? 20, 30 years old, is still in its infancy. Let's not judge it by the same standards as a literary form, the novel, which is what, 300, 400 years old. Clearly, this is a young form which has not yet reached maturity, but it contains the potential, I want to argue, to reach maturity. It contains the potential to be as involving, absorbing, as enriching as exposure to other older cultural forms, which young people today find in many ways more attractive, more valuable, more engrossing than they find the literature of the past. I think that a broader definition of culture, a definition which doesn't focus exclusively on the past, doesn't focus exclusively on a narrow range of works, a definition of culture which talks about the way that people today live their lives, opens us to understand a whole range of human activities which otherwise appear incomprehensible, which otherwise appear pointless and senseless and distractions. These are potentially, at least, as enriching, as valuable as any other form of culture.